Good morning. I want to spend just a minute and talk to the Christian this morning. I want to talk a little bit about a common idea of work. So, what is work? What is the place of work in the Christian? How should the Christian approach the idea of work? Well, in the American Christian church, many times we sort of divide our life up into what we call the real world and the spiritual world. And so the way we look at it, and it applies to a lot of things, not just work, but we have this idea that the world is basically divided up into two categories: the mundane, everyday sort of thing, like my work. And then there's the spiritual aspect of things, like going to church. Being involved in ministry is a type of spiritual work. Teaching Sunday school, involved in some type of Christian labor, missionary work, something like that. That's the way we look at the spiritual side of it. So that would be working for God, what we would think. And the rest of our labor, for example, the carpenters that built this porch of mine here, that would be the mundane idea, not spiritual. And so we sort of divide our lives up that way. But I want to emphasize something to you about work, the way God looks at it. I want to go back in time a few hundred years here. I want to read you something out of Mark Ward's book on the Christian worldview. He says in the Middle Ages, the idea developed that certain Christians had a special vocation or calling from God. Does that sound familiar? People with vocations were priests, monks, and nuns. In other words, the spiritual leaders of the world. All other work was mere secular work, is what I've called mundane on this little graphic I showed you. Worldly work that was lower than that of those who had a calling or spiritual work. Many contemporary Christians know that the Protestant Reformation recovered and clarified the Bible's emphasis on justification by faith. We know that. But another very significant challenge the Reformers made against medieval Christianity was in this idea, or this area of vocation. Martin Luther, in particular, argued that God calls people to work in many different areas. Every legitimate job is a vocation, according to Luther. All people can serve God in their work. This is a powerfully biblical idea, but even today, the old medieval concept of two levels of spirituality in work has a stronghold. So this idea, spiritual and the mundane, the ordinary things in life. So I encourage you to think of your calling, your work, regardless of what it is, as being done to God. It is valuable. I've also run across this in some of our Christian schools, and they have a good practice of emphasizing church attendance. Excellent. But what they tend to do is send the kids, sometimes the children will get the idea, the teenagers, that homework is not God's work. Going to church is God's work. Getting home in time where I can get ready to go to church on Wednesday night. Making sure I go to Sunday school. Those sorts of things are God's work, God's time, but my homework is not. Schoolwork, homework, those are all to be done to the glory of God. All of those should be categorized as His kingdom, His part of His work. So I just want to caution you to be careful in drawing this distinction of everyday, mundane life, and the upper story in our life is the spiritual. So the pastor's calling is spiritual. My calling is not. That's the idea that's in our head sometimes, and it's a holdover from this medieval attitude. You see, the church leaders taught that only the priesthood, only that type of work is true calling of God, and that the plowboy, the milkmaid, that work was not God's work. I just would like to encourage you to do all things to the glory of God, even mowing the grass.